and welcome to HT Deep Dive, the daily show from the Hindustan Times table, which deep dives into key issues facing India and you, and is streamed live across Twitter, Periscope, Facebook and YouTube. At center stage today, of course, is US President Donald Trump's India visit. There's no denying that India and the US have come into greater alignment on issues like China's BRI, Pakistan-based terror, Indo-Pacific, and even the Quad in recent years. But what is a niggling irritant, especially in the Trump regime, and his emphasis on America first, is trade. It's pretty clear now that Trump's India visit won't result in even a limited trade deal. Question is, can this visit build confidence to resolve the trade differences in the near or mid-term future, and why is it important to resolve those differences with the United States anyway? I'm joined by Economist Radhika Pandey and HT's foreign editor Pramit Pal Choudhry to unpack this some more. So, as I said, there are a lot of irritants in the Indo-US trade, in Indo-US trade, which is probably why a trade deal is really off the table right now. But what gives? I mean, these irritants are there. Why is it important to resolve these irritants and soon?
So, US is India's second largest trade partner, and especially from India's perspective, it is very important that these trade issues are resolved. In the last few months, we have seen that India has been imposing tariffs on manufactured goods, especially to promote the Make in India program, which has somehow been detrimental to the interests of the US, and therefore, they have imposed retaliatory actions in the form of going ahead without India on generalized system of preferences, and imposing retaliatory tariffs, and doing a number of other actions which are detrimental from India's trade point stand of view. So it is very important that from India's perspective that these issues are resolved, so that we move forward towards openness, because from India's point of view, US is the second largest trade partner and provides an immense potential for improving trade deal, because US is the second largest trade market for India.
But tell me, Radhika and Pramit, I mean, the US officials have been, talking to Indian officials for the longest time now, in anticipation of this Trump visit, in the hope of making some sort of an announcement as far as trade is concerned in this summit. But that doesn't seem likely as of now. There might be some small announcements, some, Harley-Davidson's involvements might be the order of the day. But the real trade deal is really off the table now. What we have learned is that the US officials are really blaming India for this sort of roadblock that they have hit as far as the trade deal is concerned. Is India playing India is obviously playing hardball as far as tariffs are concerned, and Modi is not giving an inch as far as trade is concerned, and as far as Modi's Make in India plan is concerned, and that Make in India is clashing with Trump's America First. This clash, do you think it could be resolved during this visit? Or at least there could be a movement forward?
Well, I don't see any agreement coming through. There's no time. Trade deals are extremely complicated, and besides arms control, there is no more complicated diplomatic negotiation than a trade deal. So if you haven't got one ready within the few days of a state visit, then you're not likely to have one.
Right.
What I gather they will announce is a process. In other words, they will say we have a timeline and a map on how we will come to a trade deal over the next 1 year or so on. But since America is heading for elections anyway and will not have a new president clear until January, America will not be in a position to negotiate a trade deal. So in effect, I would say that I would not expect anything until the beginning of next year at the earliest. And that assumes the Trump presidency comes back. If it's a new president, the agenda may have to start all the way from scratch, right, or virtually from scratch all over again. I think the issue when you say that both sides are blaming each other, that's pretty much standard. If something falls apart, you would automatically blame each other. I think there is two elements that I would argue contributed to this fallout. One is that neither side, Trump because, as you said, he has an America First policy, which, like Modi, is involved in trying to revive American manufacturing. For example, he imposed unilaterally steel and aluminium tariffs across the world, not just on India.
It didn't matter who.
Yeah, he just did it to
everybody's an enemy.
Exactly. When it comes to trade, he literally thinks that.
Exactly.
So therefore, we automatically went into a trade negotiations with the Americans, having already imposed tariffs on us for what we could see as really no real reason. Second, however, but what happened is, consistently from what the reports we have, is that both sides kept changing the agenda. The Americans kept adding items to their agenda because the president has his own concerns, as you mentioned, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, even though we import virtually none, and we probably won't because Harley-Davidson manufactures in India, but it's his personal political interest. Then the US Trade Representative's Office has its own agenda, which is often quite different from the president's. And so they would keep adding things from that agenda as well. And then you're running into a presidential election, then you add even more items because you want dairy products because Wisconsin is a swing state and it's the biggest dairy producer. You want to add things from states that are crucial.
Medical devices.
Crucial to your to your political requirements.
Yeah.
The Indian side has always had, I would argue, a problem, and it continues to this day, that to bring all of the various, we do not have an office as powerful as the US Trade Representative's Office. The Commerce Ministry is actually very weak, and it has to bring in large numbers of other ministries on board. So it's always been very slow in putting together all the support needed to fulfill even our agenda. Combined with what you've said is Modi's own sort of protectionist instincts again when it comes to manufacturing. You've seen an agenda that's kept shifting on both sides, and it became increasingly difficult to come to a final agreement before the presidential trip.
Right. The proposals in the budget related to tariffs on medical devices, walnuts, toys, they didn't help matters either. Radhika, your view on that?
Yeah, so I mean, these matters, these proposals of imposing tariffs on manufactured goods have severely hampered the India-US trade ties. And just before the budget, some negotiation was going on in ironing out differences between India and US, especially after India was not part of the generalized system of preferences. Right. And then this budget announcement came from for another set of tariff hikes on walnuts, apples, and medical devices, and so on. So that further angered the US officials, and the USTR trip to India was also cancelled because of this reason, because they were taken by a surprise that we are on one side trying to resolve the previous set of differences, and now we have a fresh set of tariffs introduced. The other point is the agricultural tariffs and tariffs on poultry items, because Trump's constituency mainly involves farmers and those who are involved in trade of dairy products and poultry products. So they are looking for higher access to Indian markets, which is not happening. So that is another very contentious issue between India and US in furthering the trade ties.
So, let's also talk about H-1B visas. That's another aspect that is likely to come up, because as far as trade is concerned, we understand that there are differences, and personally, I don't see them getting resolved anytime soon. And as you pointed out, was the new presidency coming in. If Trump comes back, great. If you can take off from where we left off, but if not, if there's a new president, then we start from scratch again. But do you see any easy resolutions to the trade? It's almost like you're stuck at one place, because as you pointed out, that there is Make in India at one end and there is America First. How important is it to resolve these situations quickly? I mean, is America more eager to resolve these differences, or should India be more eager to resolve these differences? Who will blink first?
Keep in mind that the trade in manufactured goods or in goods is only one component of a larger economic relationship. So if, for example, studies by CSIS and others have shown that if you actually factor in the capital flows into the country that are from not just America, but let's say places like Singapore and Dubai and Mauritius, which originate from the United States, America is probably our single largest source of investment as well, if you take in all the various places that it flows in from. So that part of that relationship remains healthy. The trade, if you look at the figures on FDI into India, they continue to be continue to rise despite the slowdown in our growth figures, and that probably so far shows no evidence of changing. The Modi government has increased FDI limits in a whole range of sectors, and that keeps that side of the relationship. Therefore, the Americans are quite pleased about. And then even on the trade in services, for example, the obvious one is IT services, and even special niche products like pharmaceuticals. America is by far our largest market, overwhelmingly so. So on those areas, we've seen absolutely no real problems. So you're really looking at one element of it. It's one that the President Trump takes very seriously, because, as is mentioned, his own constituency of small town industrial areas and dairy farmers takes those areas seriously. So I think what is interesting about this trip was that despite the failure to come to an agreement, Trump still felt it important to come to India. In most other countries, he's held a trip hostage to some sort of a trade agreement. And in this case, he decided he'd come anyway, even though he didn't have a trade agreement. So that indicates that at one level, there are that the overall Indo-US relationship remains solid, and even the overall Indo-US economic relationship sounds fine. But we have this problem, and it's a problem that is not so much that it's a threat to the relationship, but we have to ensure that it does not become a threat to the relationship if it starts to cause bad blood later on, maybe over the next 2 or 3 years.
Would you agree with that, Radhika? And the role of China in this entire mix, would you like to shed some light to our viewers on that particular aspect?
So, firstly, on the investment and capital flows, India has opened up since this regime, and foreign direct investment in telecom, other areas have been opened up. One ask of the US side, which seems at this moment to be very difficult to implement, is to open up the banking sector. So that is one area where they are asking, where there is some kind of an ask that RBI should be giving more licenses to US banks to set up their branches and to set up their wholly owned subsidiaries. That is something that is not happening in the immediate future, but over the course of time, there may be some agreement on that front itself. The other problem, while the overall FDI picture remains sound and robust, there are some irritants with regards to FDI in e-commerce platforms. So that is one area where the US firms, Amazon, Walmart, they are facing problems because of some flip-flops on FDI policy. So I think once that becomes clear and there is some negotiation on that front, the overall India's investment regime will become much more favorable from the point of view of the US.
Talking about technology, is 5G, discussions on 5G, that is also a big part of these talks that are going on, and can we expect some announcement there, and if not, why?
Well, I think on the 5G, the Secretary of State Pompeo had already offered or urged India to join in a coalition of the United States and Japan on 5G, which would oppose, if you wish, or rival the one that is basically dominated by China. The problem with that, it doesn't yet have a functional 5G technology, and the Japanese say that they're about 2 years away from completion. So I think at that point, when we see at least a number of options, including a South Korean one that is also on the cards, then India will make a decision. But I think India's instinct geopolitically would be to sign up with the US and Japan one because of our own concerns about China, and the fact, as you know, the government of India has already carried out a number of policies designed basically to discriminate against Chinese investment in critical infrastructure already.
Yes. So, you know, I just want to shift the focus away from, I tried to talk about it earlier, but I digressed. So it's about the H-1B visas. You know, that's a big area where discussions are indeed going to take place over H-1B visas, especially with regard to Trump's policy on immigration and immigrants. What kind of a shape do we see these discussions taking, and where are we stuck right now? And I'll start with you first, Radhika, on this.
I think there's some points of negotiations which once those are resolved, then I think we can move. And I think that this visit will have some kind of a discussion on resolving the issues on H-1B visas.
One way or the other, you feel that there's some resolution in sight.
Yeah. So what has happened is that the Trump administration has not changed any of the laws regarding H-1B visas. Those are decided by Congress and not by the executive. And Congress in turn responds to the lobbying of Silicon Valley companies or companies that hire them. The Trump administration's only response has been to tighten the administrative regulations that implement those laws. So they've made it a little more difficult for companies to get H-1B visas. They've imposed new restrictions on that, and partly they've used the excuse but that there have been a few cases of fraud regarding H-1B visas. Trump, so far as we can tell from his public statements, is not opposed to legal migration into the United States, which is why his focus has almost 99% been on Mexican, Central American migration into the country. There's not very much illegal migration from India. In the H-1B case, his primary argument has been, one, to clamp down on the fraud. And are you certain that we're not displacing U.S. workers? This is a cyclical policy situation. If you go back in the history of the H-1B visa, you often see these sudden bouts for 2 or 3 years where they clamp down, and then after a while they relax, partly because they simply run out of software programmers. But I think the other thing to keep in mind, which is I think at the heart of this, is that the nature of the software industry is changing. A lot of software programming, coding is automated and no longer requires or can be done over long distances. Doesn't actually require you to do a mode 4 service, i.e. to take somebody physically from India.
So you can just outsource.
Exactly.
Yes. So you're saying that, but there are some announcements which are in the offing, I believe, as far as H-1B visas are concerned, and hopefully positive for India, because that is an area of concern that the officials have been talking about.
Incidentally, as you may know, one of the beneficiaries of the H-1B visa is Melania Trump. She was a model when she came to the United States, and she came in as an H-1B visa holder.
Right, and then I think that issue became quite a big paramount issue over there in the United States when he started to clamp down on the against
saying you got your own wife through an H-1B visa.
Your own wife came through that. But let's come back to the fact that India and the United States have enjoyed a very, over the last 15 years or so, have enjoyed a very good relationship, primarily because strategically the United States looked at India as a counter to China in the Asia Pacific, actually in the whole of Asia. And China is one area where India and the United States, in our interests converge, and we talk in a similar tone as far as China's hegemony, or potential hegemony is concerned. As far as trade is concerned, the same restrictions that Trump is applying on China, the same restrictions Trump is trying to apply on India, and which doesn't sort of add up in the final analysis. How could the Trump administration view India a little more differently, given its strategic importance as far as China is concerned, or countering China is concerned?
So last month there was an agreement between US and China on trade deals, where some kind of softening has happened as regards to reducing tariff barriers. So that one step has taken place between US and China in some ways, try to resolve the trade differences, because China is providing largest trading. Exactly. So from US point of view, it's more important from their perspective to resolve differences with China because of their being the largest trading partner and supplier of cheap imports. So that, given that in mind, given that one kind of agreement has happened, now the next step from US perspective is to iron out some differences with India, especially in relation to if they can even move some step forward in addressing concerns on imposition of tariff on final manufactured goods and on agriculture. Because from Trump's point of view, with elections coming, unless and until they address the issues of farmers and those who are dealing with dairy product, they have to announce a very hefty aid for farmers. So it's pertinent on their part to address these concerns. Otherwise, they will have to then compensate by very high aid to farmers.
And Pramit, from the other side, from the Indian side, what are the concessions that we can probably look at so as to resolve these minor irritants as far as trade relations are concerned?
Well, I think one of the things we need to, as you've mentioned earlier, make in India and America first on manufactured goods are effectively in conflict. And we need to find a means to resolve both of these policies, reconcile these policies. One of the arguments Indians have made is that, and that's one of the reasons we are negotiating with electronic items, was the Indians said, look, most of our tariffs, and I think that's where what we're doing, we're in our negotiations, even though we didn't quite finish them, is we're redirecting a lot of those tariffs against Chinese products rather than American ones. Right. And since the vast bulk of electronic products, especially components and intermediaries, are from China. That's where we've been shifting the tariff structure. That allows us to both block Chinese products and keep the American system relatively happy. Right. The flip side, also India is saying that if you want to decouple from the supply chain network you have between China and the United States, why don't you consider transferring some of that to India? And I believe the government is trying to put together a package to try to incentivize electronics manufacturers to come to India, Taiwanese or South Koreans, who are part of that supply chain. And that would be a perfect win-win in which
that would be a perfect win-win because it also will go a long way in providing some sort of employment in an economy, exactly, and some sort of a win for Modi as far as unemployment is concerned.
And electronics is, if it isn't already, is on the verge of becoming our single largest import. It will overtake oil, if it has not already overtaken oil, as the primary import of the country. And therefore, if you want to try to maintain a certain balance of payments issues or are concerned about current account deficits, then electronics is an area India needs to be able to be part of. But right. That's always been a very complex supply chain system in which China is the hub more than anything else. On the services side, I don't see any real problems. I think the future problem is going to be the data digital side. Radhika mentioned about the issue of e-commerce, but digital payments, that entire digital India stack that the government of India is putting together and pushing forward will also is already beginning to run into the American domination in these fields. And that's another area we're going to have to reconcile.
Right. So as I wind up this discussion as far as trade is concerned and as far as a trade deal is concerned between India and the United States, the bigger question, and if you can just sum up in two lines each, do you believe that this visit, obviously the trade deal is off the table for now, but do you believe that this visit will pave the way for another trade deal in the near or midterm future, which really is before December?
Yeah, so I think this visit will initiate some steps towards having a trade deal in the near future. There will be some kind of confidence building measure. There will be some initial discussion to at least first focus on some low-hanging fruits, and that will be very helpful in initiating trust and confidence between the two nations. Because essentially both nations have to some degree, shun protectionism and move towards free trade, and then do some kind of a balancing, which is very difficult, to promote their own interests as well as to promote trade ties with the other countries. So I think this visit is important from that point of view, because it will initiate first steps towards initiating some kind of a package discussion.
Right, but defense deals are certainly on the table.
Defense deals are there, and we will continue to buy that, partly because there aren't too many other places for us to buy weapons of the quality that the United States has. And Russia's relationship with China is now becoming so close, it's becoming a bit difficult for us to purchase weapons from them. But remember, the defense deals are not actually part of the trade figures.
Yes.
Those are always off. We don't actually know how much we buy officially.
Right.
Those figures are never released. But it definitely helps but I think one of the important points is that on the defense side, we're insisting on a 50% offsets policy, which means that any weapon systems and the new strategic partnerships policy embodies that as well. That again, India wants to develop its own weapons, that it's ridiculous that we're the world's second largest importer of arms, and we don't even know how to build an assault rifle, forget about anything else. So again, we would like America to be one of the key partners in helping us develop an indigenous capacity, even at the component or intermediary level.
Right.
And that's another area I think that we've just begun to scratch.
Lots of possibilities and potential areas of cooperation as far as India and United States are concerned. For now, of course, it's all systems go for the Trump Jamboree starting Monday morning when he arrives in Air Force One and lands in Ahmedabad, where 10 million people or less, probably much less than that, are going to line up the streets to, for the spectacle that Ahmedabad is already preparing for. Stay tuned and keep coming back for more. We'll keep getting you more stuff on the Trump visit and on Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump's meeting. Keep watching HindustanTimes.com.